Welcome to PAS Presents, a live series created by the Percussive Art Society. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Chris Hanning, and I'm the president of the Percussive Art Society, and it is my sincere honor to welcome PAS Hall of Fame member, performing artist, composer, entrepreneur, educator, Grammy Award winner, Dame Evelyn Glennie. Welcome, and thank you for taking the time to talk to us today, Evelyn.
Thank you very much for having me.
For those of you watching at home, if you have any questions during this live video, make sure to type your comments below and we'll try to get to as many as possible. After we're done here today, this video will be saved on the PAS Facebook page as well as on the PAS YouTube channel. You can also find all the past PAS Presents videos on pas.org under resources. Welcome, Evelyn. Everyone at PAS is very excited to have this opportunity to speak to you today. And I'll start by asking you the question everybody asks during this time. How are you doing? And how has this pandemic been affecting your life?
Oh, I'm doing absolutely fine, thank you. Yes, the whole music industry is a very different landscape now than it was about 2 months ago. And I think it's given us all the opportunity to rethink what we do, how we connect with each other. I think a big challenge is trying to find the focus in what you do as a player and as a creative artist, because once you see the diary basically wiped out of concerts and events for the next few months, then you lose sort of the track of what you're meant to be preparing for. And that's kind of a very interesting scenario. But I think the most important thing is that I and my family and those I work with are all healthy and doing well, and we're coping with the situation fine.
Fantastic. That's great to hear that everybody's doing well for sure. And I know it has been indeed a challenging time for everybody, students, teachers, musicians. I'd like to start off by asking you a question. You have a really fantastic mission statement. Having had to develop mission statements before, distilling a thought down to 5 words is pretty amazing. And yours is teach the world to listen. Would you please elaborate on your mission and its applications beyond music?
Well, it really came about because, after being in this business for a number of years, I suddenly thought, well, what am I? And I'm a musician, I create sound. And it seems that sound, whether it is sound or no sound, is the one thing that links one person to another. So it's a kind of bridge. And when you give masterclasses or you're trying to inspire someone, or you're giving little workshops for kids and so on, that's all about listening. It's listening from our own point of view and listening from the audience or the participators' point of view. So, and I really discovered that a lot of the challenges we have, whether in the workplace or at home, socially, trying to understand each other, is about listening, and that's quite different to hearing something. So, hearing is a medical situation, whereas listening is something that we decide and actively engage in. And we engage in listening when we get up in the morning, as soon as we get up, because we might say to ourselves and talk to ourselves and think, oh, shall I have a shower first or have breakfast first? And then you decide what you're going to do. And that's a form of listening. So, and we discover really that, as musicians, we're specific listeners. That doesn't necessarily make us brilliant listeners at everything else we do, but we listen in particular ways. Sometimes it's like looking through a microscope. Other times we have to zoom out and listen to the big picture of things. But ultimately, it's trying to understand socially, religiously, education-wise, arts-wise, sporting-wise, business-wise, all sorts of things. What does listening do to us, and how does it change in various situations? So can you imagine someone who's just been sentenced to 20 years in prison? How does their listening change? Or someone, a mum who's just expecting a baby in the next week, and then the arrival of that baby, how do their listening skills change? And so on and so forth. And if we have a better understanding of that, then we may make more bridges.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's really terrific. And it kind of leads itself, that answer leads me to the next question, which is, we tend to use the term to describe some artists as Renaissance. And you've taken that idea to the extreme, having commissioned, performed, recorded, composed, authored books, designed jewelry, worked on film projects. There seems to be very few areas of the music industry you haven't explored. Can you talk about what motivates you to take on such a variety of projects?
Well, I think basically when I left school at the age of 16, I went to school in the northeast of Scotland. The aim was really, really simple. I want to be a solo percussionist. That was it. That was all I had to really focus on. And I discovered that when I became a full-time student in London at the Royal Academy of Music, it was very much orchestral based and there was no solo at all. And however, it made me really understand an awful lot about the business really early on. So in those days, I thought, well, in order to have a new piece of music written, you would just simply ask a composer to write something and they would either say yes or no. And well, when they did say yes, they obviously said, when my fee is X, Y, or Z. And I thought, fee, money, what do I pay them with, you know? And that really, you know, popped me down the path of trying to find out about commissioning. Who do you approach? How do you do this? How do you put on these performances? How do you move the gear? Where am I going to store the instruments? There were all sorts of aspects just to function and to create that career of a sustainable solo percussion player. So I think early on it's been drilled into me what's kind of involved. And as we practice for however long per day, you know, an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever it is, and we shut that door afterwards, we've got to think, well, what am I going to do with that practice? So, you know, it's not just going to magically, you know, form into something else without us actively creating an opportunity ourselves. So when you are preparing, it's not just that piece of music, it's the opportunity of how you're going to use that piece of music. That's really, really important. So I suppose that for the solo percussion side of things, you know, all sorts of things have to be built on as regards to relationships with promoters, with audiences, and educating them about not just the repertoire, but your family of instruments as well. And most of all, allowing them to believe in what you do as a player, believe in the repertoire, believe in that emotional aspect of what you do. So, and that's thankfully all happened, not just by myself, but by lots of people and everyone who's involved in this at the time being.
That's terrific, and that also kind of segues. You're talking about repertoire, and you know, having followed your career throughout my entire career, and have seen you present clinics on many occasions. I was very influenced by a clinic I saw you present several years ago, where you described your process for learning a new piece of music. It was a description that I used with a lot of my students, and would you mind sharing your thoughts with the audience and describe how that process may have changed throughout your career?
Well, I'm not sure if I've ever been aware of an actual process, because I think it depends on when you receive that piece of music, what that piece of music has been written for. So whether a whole barrage of instruments or one instrument, and then what the occasion might be for when you actually perform that piece of music. And so is it going to be for only a recording, or is it going to be for a live performance? And what might that audience be? And then, of course, the realistic time scale that you have, because, of course, when you're learning a piece of music, other things are still going on as well. So it's almost as though you're spinning plates. And I feel that it's not so much the amount of time that you give to a piece of music, it's the quality of time. So really you can have maybe half an hour, but if you have a set kind of aim within that half hour, so it could be that you want to learn a particular phrase, or you want to address some sort of technical aspects from the percussionist's point of view, or you might just want to experiment with interpretation in a bit. Or you might feel, no, I want to start from the beginning to the end, warts and all, and see what happens. Or you might think to yourself, now I'm going to imagine myself playing this piece with microphones everywhere, and I'm making a commercial recording of this. Or now I'm going to pretend I'm playing this piece of music in an outdoor venue, so therefore I'm dealing with the birds and the bees and the winds and people moving around and eating their picnics and whatever. How would I project that piece of music? So it's trying to put yourself in different scenarios like that, and that will help you be more elastic with your thinking when you are performing a piece of music. Because ultimately, so many times you're asked to perform somewhere and you've never been in that hall before, you don't know the acoustics of that hall. And when you are in a hall, it's like getting to know a person. So you don't know everything about that person on a first date. And in the same way, you don't know everything about a hall or a theatre or whatever it is on that first date that you have. It takes many performances for you to get to know all of just the subtleties of that hall. So I think everybody has different ways. I have different ways. Obviously, things like YouTube and the internet and how we can converse with people is possibly the one most single thing that's changed for people, in that when you go into music institutions, the practice rooms are all kitted out with laptops or whatever. And that obviously wasn't the case in my day. And I don't rely on that to this day. I need to listen to myself first. What is inside of me saying? And then for me to experiment with that and then zoom out and look at the big picture. And that's the time when I would like then to see, other types of approaches and so on. But if I start doing that to begin with, I'm then not listening to myself. I have to listen to myself, my own journey, how I decide to do things, how those things can change, what reasons are those based on my experience, my height size, my length of arms, my size of hands, whatever it might be. So everything is coming from your own personal journey.
Fantastic. That's and that's what I'm talking. When I said your process, it was when you spoke in your clinic, you talked about that many of my students at the time, when they would get a new piece of music, they would start with page one and they just start learning the notes with no thought behind what is this piece, what am I trying to say with this piece, where might I perform this piece, and that's very inspirational message for our students who don't necessarily think about the big picture like that, having not performed quite a bit on stage or in various venues. So
absolutely, and you're absolutely right, because in a way a piece of music is like a story, so instead of the words there, we have these little dots, but it's often what we don't see that sort of ping out of us at us if we take the time to look at that. So it's a funny kind of thing, because you're looking at things that you can't actually see sometimes. And that needs time. And what I always need when I'm learning a piece of music is time away from the piece. So even if you think, oh my gosh, I should be practicing this piece of music, actually, if you're not just quite feeling as though you want to be doing that, don't necessarily worry about that, because there can be things seeping through your system and in your head that actually it's more beneficial to just kind of step away from it. And so many times I found that, if I'm just getting away from a piece of music for maybe 2, 3, 4 days, and then you go back to that, it's unbelievable the progress that has miraculously been made. So you're subconsciously kind of thinking about things in your mind. And it's a good thing to do that, because we're not always able to have a set of timpani in a hotel room or a drum set or a marimba or whatever it might be. So this kind of thinking about things away from your instrument is really quite important. So it's just almost like a more holistic approach, I suppose. But at the same time, there are situations whereby you're given a piece of music, you're asked to prepare that in a really short period of time, and that is a case whereby you are literally, looking at those notes, you're seeing which passages might be coming, later on in the piece, and trying to build the blocks like that. And that's obviously a more stressful process, but it's not a bad thing to feel that as well, just to know what it feels like.
Excellent. There's a question that's come up from one of our listeners, or watchers, I should say, online, and I think there's a terrific video that I saw of you talking about listening to sound, and you're playing a bass drum. It's really fascinating, and I think it ties into Pete Krostag's question. Do you think that your hearing loss helped you to understand how to listen to things on a different plane?
Yes, I do, because I remember when I began losing my hearing from the age of 8, and then I became dependent on hearing aids during my school years. And I thought that sound, the only way to listen was through the ears. And the hearing aids really boosted the sound, but it didn't give you the clarity. So you ended up with this kind of real barrage and just sort of sploosh of sound coming your way, but you couldn't actually decipher the strands, the texture. And so with percussion, of course, you are dealing with lots of different types of frequencies and attacks and sustains and all sorts of things. And I remember my teacher at school, I was around, well, I started when I was 12 years old, and I was just getting very frustrated because I could feel that the sense of touch was really being compromised because I was so trying to get things through the ear. So, and I found myself within myself, I felt myself quite sensitive, with the sense of touch. I knew the differences there, but it wasn't translating through the ear. And so my teacher struck 2 hand-tuned timpani, and he just waited after he struck one, and he sort of said, "My gosh, there's real resonance from this drum. Does that mean that we resonate, the human body? Do you think we could perceive this vibration?" And what he did was that he asked me to put my hands on the wall of the music room, and he struck one of the timpani, and he said, "Where are you feeling that, physically feeling it?" I said, I think I'm feeling it from here to here on my hand. And then he struck the other drum, a different pitch. Oh, well, I think I'm feeling it from here, maybe to here or something, whatever it was. And it was just as though the rays of sun had appeared, because it made me realize that this body is a resonating chamber. And I then had to pay attention to the attack, to then the journey of the sound, the resonance of that sound, and then what happens to that sound thereafter. So the choice of when you link the next sound. And as I sort of grew older, that really had a tremendous influence on me in how I interpret music, because there is the tendency whereby you become sort of embarrassed about silence, or you feel, oh, you want to fill in the gaps, or you don't know what to do with yourself in silence and so on. But actually, there's no such thing as silence. That sound is still motoring along, even if the ear isn't picking it up. The body, if you pay attention, will still be picking something up. But we have to really, really focus and concentrate on that. So yes, I think that there is a different dimension. I'm not saying it's better or worse. It's just a different dimension, and one that's been really essential for me.
Fantastic. Having heard you talk about sound so many times and experiencing these ways, I think helps us as musicians to think about the sounds we're making when we're striking any instrument. And I think the comfort with the silence between notes is something that for many of us takes a while to understand and appreciate, especially the tension that is built up when silence is there, that helps create the next moment of any piece of music, or even in conversations. I think it's really terrific.
And I think so. And I think with percussionists, we've got this such visual aid always, it always looks wonderful, whenever you see a percussion player. And, we sometimes rely on that actually. And we sometimes want the audience to feed off that first of all. And also the fact that often we're detached from our instrument. So we have the stick or mallet, not always, of course, but very often we do. And therefore, it's not quite the same as if we were, playing a cello or playing the violin, or where we had direct attachment and where that instrument really connected with a large part of our body. There's nothing like that when we're holding a stick. Not really, there's no part of our body that's attached to that instrument. So it is a kind of different relationship, but at the same time, that drum or cymbal or timpani or marimba isn't our instrument. The room is our instrument. So as we look down, actually we need to feel what is actually happening around in that room, so that we are an ingredient as regards to how that room is going to take the sound and really make that sound story.
I have to say that as a timpanist, I've always been jealous of bass players who I see are put the bass next to their ear to help their intonation. I always wanted to be able to stick my ear on the side of the bowl of the drum, you know, am I in tune when I'm playing? It would really be helpful. But and speaking of instruments, you have an instrument collection that exceeds over 2,000 instruments. Are there any particular instruments you're drawn to more than others?
Well, no, not really. And I'm in the process of actually putting the instruments onto a database, or having them at least prepared to go onto a database. And what I've discovered, and this is one of the things that the lockdown has allowed me to do, is to have the time to do this. And over the past 4 years, I've had 4 volunteers working on the complete Evelyn Glennie collection and collating everything together. But the instruments is really something that I can really only do. And because I know the story behind the instrument. So I don't want people just to see, oh, that's a marimba and, you know, that's that sort of thing, and a little bit of information, but what's the story of that particular marimba? And what I find fascinating with this exercise is that I'm literally taking each object, you know, off the shelf or looking at it and sort of reconnecting with it. So, and it's been absolutely fascinating, and I've really spent time with the instrument. So, for example, this month it's been the Irish bodhrán, and it's just incredible that when I last visited that instrument and tried to play it 20 odd years ago, how the techniques have really advanced, and where you can see the bodhráns now, the actual drums themselves and the tippers and how they've moved on, and just all sorts of things. And you discover that, you know, this instrument has not just been hostage to Ireland, you know, or people interested in that kind of music. It's now a world instrument that can be connected and combined with all different types of music from around the world. So that's just one tiny example. And it's good to get different muscle groups going again, you know, on instruments that you don't normally play. So I find it really interesting, and it's almost rekindled an incredible passion, you know, towards all of these objects again, and it's allowing them to have a voice. So it's just been really fun, and as I say, that's what this period has allowed me to do.
That's exciting. I think for many of us, we would love to see that database and see your descriptions of your instruments would be fascinating.
Absolutely, and that will hopefully be available, but I'm not going to promise when that's going to be available, because it's going to take me years, I think, to do this. But nevertheless, it will definitely be for the public.
Oh, I'm sure of that. And speaking of music, Ken Watts has a question on here. And do you ever perform microtonal music, and do you enjoy performing microtonal music if you have had that experience?
Yeah, no, I haven't really had much experience of that at all. And it seemed as though that was quite a big thing back in the 90s, and there were several performances of one thing or another, not just by percussion players in the UK. It almost seemed to have a phase in a way. And so no, I didn't get into that. I think partly because I was looking for things that I could fill a hall with. You know, I was very much into finding and having repertoire composed that would be relatively easy for promoters to program and to understand. So, and although there are wonderful new music festivals around the world, and here in the UK, the audiences can be quite a minority, and so you had to I had to think about that, because ultimately promoters were deciding whether to have a violinist, a percussionist, a pianist, or whatever. So I really had to think what would bring an audience in and make sure that it was completely suitable for the main subscription series.
That's you know, speaking of performances on stage, you know, most percussionists have never experienced touring as a soloist as you have, especially music at such a high level of complexity. Are there methods you use to keep the music fresh and interesting for you as a performer when presenting multiple pieces or presenting a piece multiple times a year or more?
I unfortunately haven't been able to completely control that aspect, because, you know, things have really changed. When I started out in the career, musicians would have a manager, a PR company on the whole. In my case, a record contract, and then the PR connected with that. And so what you recorded, you would then tour with. And that tour would make geographic sense. And that's how things more or less function then. And so you would end up playing the same piece of music several times in a season. But then as the years have gone by and record companies have sort of dissolved or morphed into other things, it's been much more project by project based. And that means you don't really know when you're going to be playing certain pieces of music. So you're picking at things like this, you know, so you have a tree that's full of different kinds of fruit. And so I remember, you know, when I first went to Australia and the first few times going to Australia and New Zealand, and, you know, the orchestras would say, oh, yes, if you're playing such and such a piece, we'll have all the orchestras play that, because the places were so far apart from each other that, you know, you weren't going to get the same audiences in Perth, Australia than you would in Sydney. But that now, of course, they do want different repertoire. They don't want to be duplicating what another orchestra is doing. So it is quite interesting. And I just think that in my case, it's been a situation where what does it feel? What feels right for you, I suppose, you know, and what do you think, what sort of things do you feel ready to be performing at that particular moment? And discussing what the theme the promoter wants or is thinking about, and yeah, it's just really thinking what is right for that particular occasion rather than trying to fit something in for everything.
Thank you for that answer. And our executive director has posted a question, Joshua Simon, so I definitely have to get to that. Oh. Are there some favorite artists that you have collaborated with, and are there some that you would like to, that maybe you haven't collaborated with yet?
Yes, I think that collaborations is something that I've definitely involved myself more in recent years. So now that the solo repertoire has more or less established itself, we can still all contribute to that. We need to, so it can't just stop. But it's not as though I'm sort of running around like a headless chicken, you know, trying to ask every composer, you know, to write something. So I think that really for me, I've had the chance to work on the collaborations much more. They're all interesting because collaborations means, certainly I feel, is so you're pushing your boundaries. You don't know quite what's going to happen, and that's a healthy collaboration because you know you want to, I suppose, connect with people whereby there is this question mark, and you're trying to explore new territory. A lot of people come to a crossroads in their careers, not just once in their career, but very often, and it's often the collaborations that can give it a kick start. And it's the kind of unknown, really, that is really interesting when you collaborate. So, you know, for example, when I collaborated with Björk, I mean, she doesn't actually read music, but she's unbelievably creative. And it was as though I was fishing, you know, trying to fish out from her head, oh, what's she thinking there? Or what is she describing there? Or, oh, you know, I wonder where she's going with that. And you're literally fishing and trying to tie up the dots and experiment with the most unlikely things. And that was a really healthy collaboration. Or someone with like Mark Knopfler in collaborating on the Altamira film, and where he said, look, he's very much a melody man. He's just a genius at creating a melody. And I said, well, that's fantastic. Whereas I prefer developing the soundscape type of things. And so, you know, again, we really, you know, came with each other. It was basically guitar and percussion and a few strings here and there, but that was it, you know, an unlikely kind of collaboration. But when there's this sort of open communication, and it's really interesting. It's so fulfilling.
Yeah, it's the one thing that makes this moment in time so challenging, because although a lot of people are collaborating through the internet, there's nothing like collaborating in person and hearing the sound and ideas of that person in the moment. I can't wait for us to get back to that.
I think that's true. And I think also a lot of collaborations are about not what happens on stage or as you're preparing something. A lot of the understanding happens over a cup of tea or coffee or something like that. You know, it's away from the instruments. It's, you know, finding out how people speak and how they are, you know, just socially and things like that. And a lot of the ideas can really sprout from those situations. So, but to answer Joshua's latter part as regards to who I'd like to collaborate with, I've always wanted to collaborate with Kate Bush and Eminem. So we'll see, maybe one day.
That's fantastic. Well, let me get to a question of mine that I really want to ask you. You know, following your career, looking on your website, and the number and level of prestige of all the many accolades that you have received throughout your career is really quite amazing. And can you talk about a few that have been most meaningful to you and why?
Well, you know, they're all different. They've all happened at different times of my life, and therefore they're all special. I remember receiving the first Grammy, and I mean, it arrived in the post, can you believe? So I didn't go to the ceremony or anything, I couldn't afford that, but it arrived in the post, and the little gramophone thing had broken off. So the first thing I did was that I had to get the super glue out and stick it back on again. But you know, that was for me a wonderful moment where I was very young and I thought, my God, right, okay. And it just gives you this sort of real inspiration to move forward. It really does. And that's important. Something like the Polar Music Prize was very unexpected and really interesting for me because it's always shared with someone else. And they're looking at musicians from all different avenues. So, you know, it was, in this case, it was myself and Emmylou Harris. And it was just fantastic to meet her and get to know her and find the common things that make people tick, you know, in the professions. We're basically two musicians, you know, and just really, really interesting. So that was quite fascinating. But yes, each situation just gives you a chance to pause, reflect, and to think, right, how can you move forward to keep making a difference?
Excellent. I'm going to go back to the list of questions on the web here. From Lutz Mueller, in your collection, you have a very special woodblock xylophone. Have you used that in a concert that we can all see, perhaps in YouTube or on a DVD?
I've never used it in concert, actually, but I do have a little YouTube video where I'm just sort of playing around on it. It's one of the playing around the office videos from my YouTube channel. So, and it is an unusual instrument, and I actually bought this from a gentleman in the US, can you believe? But I'm frightened I crack the wood blocks because to find a replacement might be a wee bit of a challenge. So it's one piece that I look at most days when I'm here, and I think, gosh, how unusual is that? And I sort of let the composers have a look at it too, because I think definitely, you know, this can be replicated for sure. But no, I have not taken it out in a performance situation.
And this is a question that is not on my initial list, but since you're talking about instruments, when you're collaborating with composers, and I would imagine this is true, the few that I've worked with oftentimes will come to me and ask me to pull out my favorite instruments and create some setups or soundscapes that the composer will then write to that. How often does that happen for you? Do you oftentimes, you know, talk to the composer about these are the instruments that I would really like to use for my collection? Do you bring composers to your collection and pull instruments out and show them? How does that process, how has that worked for you in the past? Or are there any very special collaborations with the composer that were very memorable in that way to you?
Well, it's really varied. The process has been completely varied according to the composer. When I was young and commissioning pieces, I wanted everything and the kitchen sink. So I just say to the composer, go, you know, I have access to this or that, and so on. And then I discovered that that was actually pretty unresponsible and unreasonable because there was an awful lot of logistical things and time to set up. And I had lost track of the fact that well, I want other people to play these pieces, but I don't want all of their energy trying to find all of this equipment. So I basically got myself together and thought, no, this needs to be a more practical, there has to be a practical way of moving forward. So then, as I think time went on, composers became much more knowledgeable towards percussion. So some composers would say they would like to write for X, Y, or Z. For example, Christopher Rouse, with his percussion concerto, Der gerettete Albrecht, he said to me, look, I'm more of a drum man. He writes more for drums than perhaps mallets, so therefore it'll be more of a drum kind of piece. And I said, that's fine. And that was that. And he came along to a few concerts in the US. We talked about the Wagner's Der gerettete idea, and would I be happy kind of being the little impish elf, Albrecht and so on. And for which I said, absolutely. And so after that, he said, leave me alone now. I'm going to write the piece of music and then I will give you the finished score. And that's exactly what he did. And nothing needed to be changed. When I've been working with Michael Doherty on his 2 percussion concertos, UFO, which is a big setup, and then Dream Machine, which is far more compact, so really, really nice and compact. He very much likes to liaise with the performer during the writing process, and that I like that as well, and that really works. And I remember when we premiered his UFO, I think it was in Washington DC, and the second main movement has this beautiful melody, but after the premiere, he said, no, I'm going to change that melody, When I worked with John Corigliano on his percussion concerto, which the original title of that was Triple Play, it's in 3 movements. And when he saw the premiere of that piece, he said, no, that title isn't right, because you look as though you're a conjurer, hauling sounds out of a hat. He said, I think we should call it Conjurer. And so that's why the change of name. So if you see 2 titles with it, the most up-to-date name is Conjurer. Now, John flew over from the US to my studio here in the UK and spent a whole day, and I'm not exaggerating, a whole day on mallet choices. So he quite literally wanted to find out this and that on the various things, what would sound best in his mind. And so he was extremely particular, extremely detailed. And even after the many performances we gave, and he attended many of them, after each performance, he would always say, oh, maybe we could try this, maybe we could try that. So always, in a good way, nitpicking at things. And so it was fascinating working with him. As the years have gone by, obviously the economic climate has really changed for orchestras and for promoters. And so a lot of orchestras are asking for maybe 1 instrument to be used, 2 instruments at the most sometimes, especially with the chamber orchestras and especially if they're touring. So that's really made me think I've got to get a body of repertoire for just a really, really compact set of instruments. So things have changed over time.
That's great. And I think that that relationship of working with a composer, for those that are listening out there who haven't experienced that, it's such a wonderful thing to experience as a player, to have the composer that's dreamed up the music, especially being able to come to multiple performances and hear you perform and say, hey, this is working, this isn't working, and being able to shape the piece from that moment on is such a thrill. And any chance to have that is always a great experience. We have another question online. Karen Beth Solzinski, Sweat, as a longtime fan of yours, I'd be interested to know which percussionists or musicians influenced you in your younger years.
Well, I was brought up in a farming community in Scotland, and we didn't have people come in, give workshops or masterclasses or anything like that. We didn't even have a music shop there. So really, my influences were my school pals and the school teachers. When I became a full-time student, however, the 2 musicians that I was very much drawn to was the late Canadian pianist Glenn Gould and the late British cellist Jacqueline Dupre. And I think what captured me enormously with them was the sheer giving as performers. Jacqueline was just everything. It just oozed out of every pore of her body when she played, and you truly felt as though she was the composer, the performer. She was sweeping up the audience in her performance. She was like the just giving us something that went far beyond the piece of music, far beyond the cello. It was just an experience. It really was, and I can't describe it, but she just was remarkable as a communicator. And then, of course, Glenn Gould was eccentric and, you know, could take relatively old pieces of music, Baroque repertoire, Bach, you name it, and make it feel as though it was the newest thing that had just been written, you know. And so his exploration of that kind of music was so interesting. And yes, some people liked it, some people didn't. Some people thought he was mad, you know, and some people thought he was a genius. Whatever, it didn't matter. The point was that he was giving us a whole different landscape as regards to these pieces of music. So he also had a big influence on me.
You know, I'm thinking about the influence on your lives and thinking about all the performances that you've had throughout your career. I mean, you've played in amazing venues. I had the opportunity to play at the Proms once, and you know, Royal Albert Hall is just an amazing place to play. You've actually opened for the Olympics. Do you have some favorite performance memories?
Well, the Olympics was really interesting because of how it was all knitted together, first of all. You know, seeing the almost like papier-mâché model that Danny Boyle had of his vision, you know, in his workshop, and being there and just, you know, seeing what he was thinking and feeling that really. So just being part of all of those processes, and then seeing how the technical team were going to, you know, have 1,000 drummers, you know, linked up in order to play together, kind of thing. The decision of what sort of drums to be used. Well, we happened to use buckets in the end because we didn't want, we needed the kind of the sound, the smell, and to feel the sweat of an industrial revolution sound, you know. We needed that scrunch of a sound, not the precision, not an ethnic sounding environment, but just this hard, sweaty, working type of sound, and hence the buckets. But that whole experience will remain in my mind for sure because of the sheer teamwork and the expertise of everybody involved, the amount of volunteers, people who had never picked up a stick before. And, you know, the funny thing about this is that when you give someone a drum who's maybe never played a drum before, and they might say, oh, I don't know what to do, I don't know what player, oh, I've got no rhythm, or whatever it is. But if you give them a bucket, bang, 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 you know, they'll immediately strike it, and it's not a problem. So, and I think psychologically that had a very interesting effect on everything. So that was important to me. I think also something like the premiere of Veni Veni Emmanuel by James Macmillan in 1992. That was at the Proms in London. That was the first ever percussion concerto in the over 100-year history in the Proms. And that was a remarkable feat, not for me, but I mean, well, first of all, the original conductor became ill a week before the performance, so we had to draw another conductor in. So he had to frantically learn the score. But it was just such a great piece of music, and it just seemed to capture the audience in a way that was totally unexpected, and certainly unexpected coming from percussion in this type of context. You know, seeing percussion at the front of the orchestra and using an old French plain chant, O come Emmanuel, but having this contemporary take on it, and having, you know, the pounding heartbeats coming from every member of that orchestra, you know, to come together. And that's what we feel right now with the situation that we're all experiencing. We're aware of people's, you know, the beating of society and how we're connecting with each other. And definitely that was a piece that did that. And it was I suppose the offshoots and the progression that allowed for percussionists and for orchestras, and having faith in putting percussion concertos on was quite remarkable, really.
You've commissioned a lot of pieces in your career, but you've also composed quite a few pieces. And I know you said in an interview once that you're not a composer with a capital C, but you have done quite a bit of composing. And one of our folks that are watching here has asked, what advice do you have for someone who's never composed a piece and doesn't know how to start? This is Juan Ramirez.
Oh, well, most of my composing is for media purposes, so for films, radio, for television, and that's where I can use a lot of the unusual instruments. This period with COVID-19 has allowed me to compose a few other bits and pieces, really, for various projects that I've been asked to do. What's really important for me is to not be frightened of a blank sheet of paper. You know, is to feel quite okay at just sort of looking at a piece of paper and not be worried if something isn't immediately coming out. So it's to actually feel comfortable with that blank sheet of paper. The other thing is just to give yourself a few moments every day of just writing something. And it doesn't have to be anything in particular. It's getting used to just, oh, these notes work well together, or no, these notes don't work well together, but I'm still going to write them down. So it's the process of thinking of something and then physically writing it down. Now, mainly I do my composing at the piano, and then I just have a manuscript bit of paper and a pencil, and off I go. And you end up before long, you know, if you do that once a day for 7 days, you've then got 7 little ideas. You know, maybe only one of those ideas will be worth returning to, but it's just getting into this sort of attitude and process of feeling comfortable with this bit of paper, comfortable with you just, you know, popping a few things on that paper, and bit by bit by bit, you'll sort of start to form some longer ideas or multiple ideas, or you might feel that, oh, actually, you know, crumbs, I've been here for an hour, you know, and I was only thinking maybe 15 minutes or something. And that's all healthy things, you know. And then other days you might go to it and absolutely nothing happens at all. And that's fine, because things will always be sifting around in your head. But just get used to doing this on a pretty regular basis.
Great advice for composers, for sure, and for practicing and all playing. That daily practice is so important. We have a terrific question and by Stavros Varissis, and sorry, Stavros, if I've mispronounced your name, but some people are afraid to play live performance. This whole idea of stage fright is something that many people wrestle with. What is your advice to them?
Yes, well, you know, I think 99.9% of people on the planet, including myself, get nervous for performances. It's a natural feeling. Human beings, you know, have this ability to feel nerves. And we have to recognize that that is just a complete and utter natural reaction. And when you sort of embrace that reaction, it kind of puts it in perspective in a way. And for me, it's important, I suppose, not to be hostage to certain things. So I don't have any rituals. I don't have any things that I must do in order for something else to function. I basically observe the situation I'm in and sort of really think that, okay, this is where I'm at this moment in time. I'm prepared as far as I can be, you know, with the situation. You know that live performances are going to go up and down, but the ups and the downs need to be just more temperate like this, so that you don't have a really great performance and then a really, really disastrous performance. So, you know, we can afford to go like that, but not like that. So, and it's really, again, a little bit like the composing, is just doing it as much as you can. And what is important is that in my mind, I have a kind of difference between practice and rehearsal. So practice for me is sorting out, it's almost like weeding your garden, you know, it's that needs sorting out, or that needs sorting out, or da 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 da. So it's from the percussionist point of view. But then the rehearsal in my mind, even in the privacy of my own four walls, is thinking, right, now I'm in an outdoor venue, or now I'm in a cathedral, or now I'm in a studio, and imagining the recording engineer in the booth, imagining just saying, right, ready, or whatever, or the green light comes on. And how does that make you feel? What's the difference between that scenario in your mind to being in a recital hall? Do you feel any difference? What is that difference? Or being in an outdoor venue, what's the difference there? And if you can begin to just sort of pinpoint one or two little things and to see what those differences are, you'll get to know yourself more. Because ultimately, I can't sort of get in and have a jolly good look at your nerves, and see how they are. I can't get inside of you, but I can, sort of give the feeling from my own perspective of the fact that we all get nervous. And these are the sort of things that I do, rather than I warm up like this and that will solve my nerves. But that might be really helpful for another person. So don't dismiss that at all. That can be really important. But just from my perspective, that's how I deal with it.
Well, you've been a great inspiration to all percussionists and musicians around the world, but especially for women. And what is your advice for women in percussion? Pauline Roberts has written this on our public page.
Well, I find this more of a challenge to answer, because at the end of the day, people do what they do, and if they do it with conviction and as best as they can, then it will get through. It will get through the layers and layers and layers that people are seeing today. And I think that I don't really think of gender so much in this kind of context, because if you're working hard, if you're getting involved and trying to understand the business that you're in, for me it was solo percussion. So therefore I was just on my own. I was just traveling around the world by myself. So I wasn't part of a group of people. I wasn't in some sort of team or so gender really had absolutely very, very little to do with my career in a way. I think the only time I felt something was when I happened to be in the early years in Japan, whereby the promoters really wanted female musicians to be dressed in long dresses, and which was very impractical for me as a percussion player. And I said, no, I really need to wear trousers or whatever I needed to wear. And also it just felt right for me to do that and to dress in the way I wanted to dress. And so once you nip that in the bud immediately, then, it's clear, and people are clear as to where you're coming from. It's so important to just listen to who you are and just have faith in who you are, what you believe in, and just get on and do it.
I have another question for you. I was working, actually teaching a group of elementary school teachers how to use world percussion in the classroom. And I was so surprised when I came across a few books of yours that were focused on young students. And so you've obviously spent a lot of time thinking about education broadly for music, not only in your own country, but throughout the world. What do you think your thoughts on the future of education for percussion or musicians in general?
Well, we get a lot of correspondence from, first of all, primary school teachers. So that is teachers teaching very, very young infants, basically, and whereby they're having to deal with percussion, and sometimes they don't know really what to do with it, or they may be given a budget and they don't know what to buy, which instruments to buy. And so I always feel that, when you're dealing with percussion at that age, is to think about your sound diet. So making sure the youngsters have, low sounds, mid sounds, high sounds, have a diet of sustained sounds and short, sharp sounds. And because what is inclined to happen is that there's an awful lot of shakers, an awful lot of rattles, an awful lot of little glockenspiels, and everything is at the upper register frequency-wise. And then, thought about the weight of sticks and mallets, and often they're very, very light indeed. But actually for youngsters, they're extremely flexible, just naturally flexible. They're the best sort of example of how to hold mallets, you know, we can possibly have. And they will be able to cope with a bit of weight, actually. Very often they're asked to sit on the floor, and when they do that, they use their stronger hand, and everything is slightly lopsided when they play. So immediately they're not getting the full resonance of that sound. So it's just bits and pieces like that that we think about, and then ask the teachers to really explore soundscapes, sound stories, rather than getting worried about how to play something, techniques and so on, but really just getting the imagination flowing and really thinking about those soundscapes. But as far as music education as a whole, I think that it's so, you know, paper driven, it's so exam driven, it's you know, we're losing the sense of creativity, this real imagination from each individual. I think there's a wonderful opportunity whereby we can, even although to learn instruments is quite a challenge because schools don't have orchestras or bands in many cases, but there is a massive opportunity for youngsters to do sound technology and to really think about sound art. And a lot of youngsters are getting into that type of composing, and you don't necessarily need to play an instrument for that. So there's some really great work going on in that field, and that's really, really exciting. So although we may be losing a certain aspect of something at this point in time, we're gaining in another avenue. I think we need that balance. You know, we need people to play actual instruments and to have the patience to learn an instrument over a period of years. Of course we do. But I think we can now all learn from each other, and nations can really sort of tap in to see what other territories, what they're doing, really. Yeah.
That's terrific advice. And I know at PAS, we've been talking a lot about grassroots education and focusing a little bit more on younger students and having influence there, because we have so many members worldwide that do a lot of teaching that can be even more influential on helping teachers across the globe work with young students. We have time for one more question. And this one I find very interesting, and I'd love to hear your response to it. Mike Castle writes, "My daughter had the great honor to play you in the play Playing from the Heart and drew great inspiration from the experience. Do you have any input into the stage play?"
Wow. Well, I remember when it was being written, and it was written by Charles Way. And of course, we collaborated a lot together on the writing process. He did the writing, but he needed to know the story. And so we spent time together. And then we had a wonderful percussion player who then did all of the percussion playing in the actual premiere, and a few performances after that in London. And it was, again, collaborating with the player, because he wanted to try and get some of the little subtleties that were going on in you know, how I play, I suppose, or how I played at that particular time. And it was a really, really interesting project, most unusual, obviously, but one that I found really fascinating to be a member of the audience. So for me to look at this story of a story about myself, I suppose, but to try to zoom out and just sort of see it as a whole. And they did a wonderful job. They really did. So I appreciate the question, really. I don't know what to say about it.
Well, thank you, Evelyn. And for everyone at home, thanks again for joining us for the Percussive Arts Society's PAS Presents. If you're looking for more resources, make sure to rejoin, or renew your PAS membership online. As a percussion community, it's vital that we continue to support PAS. And Dame Evelyn Glennie, thank you for spending this time with our PAS audience. You continue to inspire us, and we are grateful for this moment to hear you share your experiences with us. I look forward to a moment we hope is very soon that we can see you on stage again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much.